I am Walter, 68 years old, and for 20 years I let my family believe I was a man who could barely keep the lights on. My son-in-law screamed at me to pay rent or get out of my own daughter's house on Thanksgiving night, certain I was a broke old widower living off his charity. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply folded my napkin, stood up from the table, and went home to quietly dismantle the comfortable life he thought he'd built without me. Before I tell you how one phone call to my accountant started the end of his marriage, let me know where you're watching from tonight, son or daughter, wherever you are. And if you've ever had someone underestimate you because you kept your mouth shut, hit that like button and stay with me till the end. The gravy boat was still in my hand when Marcus stood up. He didn't ease into it. He didn't clear his throat or ask to speak with me privately in the kitchen the way a man with any sense would have. He planted both palms flat on my daughter's dining table, right between the cranberry sauce and the plate of rolls nobody had touched yet, and he looked straight at me like he'd been rehearsing this moment for months. "I've had enough, Walter," he said. "You eat my food, you sleep under my roof, you drive around town in a car I'm still paying insurance on, $1,400 a month, starting December 1st, or you find somewhere else to be a burden." The room went still the way a room does right before a car accident, when everyone can feel it coming but nobody can stop it. My daughter Renee's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Her two boys, 9 and 11, stared down at their plates. Marcus's mother, visiting from Ohio, pressed her napkin to her lips like she could physically hold back a gasp. 16 people around that table, and not one of them said a word. I set the gravy boat down. Carefully. I didn't want it to spill on the tablecloth Renee had ironed that morning. "A burden," I repeated. "You heard me." Marcus straightened his shoulders, the way he did when he wanted people to notice the gym membership he'd started bragging about at the beginning of the year. "I built this house, this table, this whole life. My name is on the deed. I put in 60-hour weeks at that dealership so my family could eat like this. And you just sit in your recliner in my den watching your westerns and eating my groceries. I'm done carrying dead weight, Walter. If you want to keep living under my roof, you start pulling your weight starting now." I looked around that table. At the leather sectional, I'd quietly paid the difference on when Renee mentioned she liked it, but it was out of their budget. At the new roof over our heads, the one that had needed replacing 2 winters ago, the one Marcus told everyone he'd financed himself through a home equity loan, when in reality, I'd wired $11,000 directly to the roofing contractor and asked him never to mention my name on the invoice. At the turkey itself, a 22-pound bird from the butcher on Route 9, paid for on a credit card Marcus believed was tied to his own dealership bonus account. It wasn't. It never had been. I had been quietly funding this family's entire existence for 6 years, ever since my wife Diane passed, and I sold our house and moved in temporarily to help Renee through a difficult stretch after she lost her job at the hospital. Temporary had turned into permanent. And somewhere along the way, Marcus had convinced himself, and apparently everyone else in that room, that I was the one being carried. "Dad," Renee whispered, finally finding her voice. "Marcus, please, not tonight." "No, Renee, tonight is exactly the night." Marcus's voice climbed another notch, the wine in his glass sloshing as he gestured. "Your father's been mooching off us for years. My mother had to fly in from Dayton and sleep on an air mattress because there's no guest room, because he's had it since day one. I'm tired of pretending this is normal." I didn't blink. I didn't wipe the small fleck of spit that had landed near the corner of my mouth when he'd leaned across the table to make his point. I simply reached for my water glass, took a slow drink, and set it back down. $1,400 a month, I said, by December 1st. He crossed his arms, satisfied, like he'd just closed a deal on a used minivan. "Or you can go be a burden somewhere else." I stood up. I pushed my chair in, the way my own father taught me 60 years ago, and I looked at my grandsons, who were watching me with the particular kind of fear children get when the adults in the room have stopped pretending to be civil. "Boys," I said, "your grandmother would be proud of how well you're eating tonight. Finish your dinner." Then I walked out of that dining room, down the hallway past the photographs of Renee's wedding, past the school pictures I'd paid for the frames on, and into the small guest room that had been mine for 6 years. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry. I packed exactly what I needed for the night into a duffel bag. Diane had bought me for a fishing trip we never got to take together, and I called a cab, because Marcus was right about one thing. My name wasn't on that car's title. It never had been. I'd bought it for Renee, and Marcus had simply been driving it. By the time the cab pulled into the driveway of the house, I still legally owned 2 towns over. A rental property I'd told everyone was occupied by tenants who paid me a modest $400 a month. I had already made a decision. Not out of anger. Anger burns fast and leaves you with nothing but ash. This was colder than that. This was arithmetic. I let myself into that house, the one nobody in my family had ever set foot in because I told them it belonged to strangers. And I sat down at the small desk in the front room. I turned on the lamp, I opened my laptop, and I began making a list. The rent Marcus wanted from me was $1,400 a month. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been sending closer to $6,000 a month into that household in ways so quiet they'd never notice the water beneath the surface. The mortgage overpayment that had knocked 11 years off their loan, the private school tuition supplement for my grandsons, wired directly to the school so it would appear as a family scholarship rather than a payment from me. The health insurance gap coverage after Marcus switched jobs and there'd been a lapse neither of them ever knew I'd quietly closed. The dealership itself, the one Marcus was so proud of managing, the one he called his, it wasn't his, not entirely. 3 years ago, when the previous owner wanted to retire and Marcus came to me in a panic because the bank wouldn't approve his loan on his own credit, I had co-signed. Silently, I had never told Renee. I had never told Marcus's mother, who apparently believed her son was a self-made success story worth flying in from Dayton to admire. I owned 22% of that dealership, sitting quietly in a holding company under my late father's name, a company Marcus had never once bothered to look into, because why would a broke old widower own a holding company? I opened my banking portal. I looked at the standing transfers, and for the first time in 6 years, I did not send a single one. The first crack didn't take long. 3 days after Thanksgiving, my phone rang. It was my accountant, a sharp, careful woman named Priya, who had managed my finances since before Diane got sick. She told me the school had called about the tuition payment being late. She told me the mortgage servicer flagged a missed additional principal payment. She asked me, very calmly, whether I wanted to continue the standing arrangement or formally close it out. Close it, I told her. All of it. Effective immediately. Walter, she said, and I could hear her weighing her words. You understand what this means for Renee and the children? I understood exactly what it meant. It meant Renee would finally see her household budget for what it actually was, without a hidden hand smoothing every rough edge. It meant Marcus would finally have to run his life on the income he claimed, so proudly, at that dinner table, to be entirely his own. My daughter will be fine, I said. She's stronger than either of us gives her credit for. It's her husband I'm concerned about. 2 weeks passed in a strange, heavy quiet. Renee called me 4 times. I let 3 go to voicemail and answered the 4th, gently, telling her I loved her, that I was safe, that I needed some time. I didn't tell her about the money. Not yet. That wasn't a conversation for a phone call. That was a conversation that needed a table and eye contact and time enough for the truth to land without either of us flinching away from it. Marcus, notably, did not call at all. It was the second week of December when the real trouble started, and it started the way I expected it would, with panic dressed up as anger. I was sitting in my study one evening, the fire going, a book in my lap I wasn't really reading, when my phone buzzed with an alert from the dealership's holding company account. A withdrawal request, $41,000. Marcus's signature, requesting emergency capital transfer to cover, according to the memo line, seasonal payroll shortfall. I sat with that for a long moment. $41,000 was not a seasonal shortfall. I had seen the dealership's books every quarter for 3 years, quietly, through Priya, exactly as any silent partner with 22% equity has the legal right to do. Marcus had been bleeding money since September. Floor plan financing on unsold inventory. A finance manager he'd hired who'd been caught steering customers into predatory loan terms, which had triggered a state inquiry. He hadn't told anyone. He certainly hadn't told me, the man footing part of the bill without his knowledge. I called Priya first thing the next morning. Freeze it, I said. Don't approve the withdrawal. And send me everything on that dealership's financials going back to September. What came back over the following days painted a picture far worse than I'd imagined. Marcus wasn't just short on payroll. He had taken out 2 high-interest business loans against future receivables, the kind predatory lenders offer men who are too proud or too frightened to admit they're drowning. He had stopped paying the dealership's group health insurance premium 2 months earlier, which meant every employee under that roof, men and women with families of their own, had unknowingly been without coverage since October. And worst of all, buried in a line item labeled consulting fees, was a payment of $9,000 to a company that, when Priya dug into the registration, turned out to belong to Marcus's brother-in-law. Money moving in a circle, dressed up to look like a business expense, while actual employees went uninsured. I thought about those employees. Men with kids in the same school my grandsons attended. Women who'd been working the service counter since before Marcus ever walked through that door. And I thought about Marcus, standing at that Thanksgiving table with his chest puffed out, calling me dead weight while he quietly let strangers' insurance lapse to cover a payment to his own brother-in-law. I did not simply block the withdrawal and walk away. Blocking it would have only delayed the collapse by a month, maybe two. Marcus needed to understand, fully and completely, that the leash he thought he'd cut when he threw me out of that house had, in fact, been the only thing holding his entire life together. I called my lawyer, a steady, unflappable man named Gerald Whitfield, who had handled my affairs since before Renee was born. Gerald, I said, I want to formally exercise my rights as a minority equity holder. I want a full audit triggered on that dealership, and I want it done through proper legal channels, not quietly. I want Marcus's name on the request as the managing partner who is required to respond. You understand this will likely surface publicly, Gerald said. State regulators are already circling because of the finance manager situation. An audit request from a silent equity partner is going to draw attention. Good, I said. Let it. The audit request went out on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the state's Consumer Finance Division, already sniffing around the predatory lending complaints, formally opened an investigation into the dealership's lending practices and its handling of employee benefits. By the following Monday, 3 local news outlets had picked up the story, running a segment about a car dealership that let its employees' health coverage lapse, while its manager funneled consulting fees to a family member. Marcus's name was in every article. I hadn't leaked anything. I hadn't needed to. I had simply stopped protecting him from the consequences of decisions he'd already made. And once the protective wall came down, gravity did the rest. Renee called me on a Tuesday night, crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. Dad, there are reporters outside the dealership. Marcus won't tell me what's happening. The bank called about the mortgage. They said a payment lapsed. Dad, what is going on? I don't understand any of this. This was the conversation I had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. Renee, I said, can you come see me? Just you. I'll explain everything. She came the next afternoon, sitting across from me at that small desk where I'd made my list 3 weeks earlier, and I told her everything. The mortgage payments, the tuition, the insurance gap I'd closed years ago without her knowledge, the 22% of the dealership sitting quietly under my late father's name. I told her I had done it out of love, not out of some need to control her life, but that I understood now it had also, without my meaning it to, allowed her husband to build an entire identity on a foundation that was never fully his. Renee sat very still for a long time after I finished. Then she asked me the question I'd been waiting for. Did you know, when you sat there and let him call you a burden, that all of this was already sitting under the surface? Did you already know he'd taken those loans out? No, I told her honestly. I found out after. But Renee, I have to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it. I didn't build this so I could hold it over anyone's head. I built it because your mother and I never wanted you to struggle the way we struggled when we were young and had nothing. But I will not sit at a table and be called dead weight by a man who was, quite literally, standing on my shoulders the entire time. She didn't defend him. That told me more than anything she could have said. 3 weeks later, Marcus lost his managing position at the dealership. The state investigation, combined with the majority owner's understandable panic once the news broke, led to a quiet but firm removal. He wasn't arrested, not at that point, but his name in the county business registry, once attached to managing partner, Whitfield Motors, now had nothing beside it at all. That's when he came to my rental house. It was late, past 10, a hard, cold January night with wind coming off the lake behind the property. I heard the car in the driveway before I heard the knock, and I knew before I opened the door that Marcus had not come to apologize. He looked terrible. Unshaven, his coat unzipped despite the cold, his eyes red-rimmed in a way that told me he'd either been crying or drinking, possibly both. He pushed past me into the entryway before I'd even fully opened the door. You did this, he said. You sat there and let me think I built something. And the whole time you were sitting on it like a spider waiting for me to walk into the web. I didn't build your loan agreements, Marcus. I didn't let your employees' insurance lapse. I didn't send money to your brother-in-law and call it consulting. You could have stopped it. You could have warned me. His voice cracked, somewhere between rage and something closer to grief. Instead, you let it blow up in front of the whole town. My mother won't return my calls. Renee is talking about a separation. Do you understand what you've done to my family? Your family, I said quietly, sat at a table on Thanksgiving and watched you call me a burden while I quietly paid for the turkey on the table, the roof over your heads, and 11% of the interest rate discount on the very mortgage you were bragging about handling yourself. I have carried this family for 6 years without asking for a single ounce of credit. The moment I stopped, everything you told yourself about who you were came apart. That's not something I did to you, Marcus. That's something you built on a foundation you never once thanked anyone for. He stood there in my entryway, breathing hard, and for a moment I genuinely believed he might take a swing at me. I am 68 years old. I have not been in a physical altercation since I was a young man working the docks in Baltimore, and I did not particularly want to find out, at my age, whether those instincts still worked. But I did not step back. I did not raise my hands. I simply looked at him and waited. Whatever was left of his composure finally broke, not into violence, but into something smaller and sadder. He sank down onto the bottom step of my staircase and put his head in his hands, and for a long moment the only sound in that entryway was his ragged breathing. I don't have anywhere else to go, he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I stood there looking down at a man who, 6 weeks earlier, had told 16 people at a dinner table that I was dead weight in his home. And I felt, to my own surprise, not triumph. Not the sharp satisfaction I might have imagined feeling in this exact moment, back when I first opened that laptop 3 weeks ago and stopped the transfers. What I felt instead was something closer to tired clarity, the kind you feel at the end of a long project when the work is finally truly done. You have somewhere to go, I told him. It's just not here, and it's not going to be handed to you. Get up, Marcus. Go to your mother's, or a hotel, or your brother-in-law, since the two of you seem to have a financial relationship already established. I said it without cruelty, only fact. But you are not staying in a house that belongs to me, after telling me I wasn't welcome in one that, as it turns out, never fully belonged to you either. He left that night without another word. I heard later, through Renee, that he moved into a small apartment above the hardware store on 5th Street, the kind of place I imagine feels very different from a house with a leather sectional and a 22-pound Thanksgiving turkey. Renee and Marcus separated in February. Not because of the money, she told me later, though the money had certainly been the thing that finally forced the truth into daylight. It was because, in the weeks that followed, she'd had time to sit with the memory of that Thanksgiving table, of the way he'd spoken to her father in front of her sons, of the version of himself he'd shown everyone the moment he believed he finally had power over someone. She said she couldn't stop seeing it once she'd truly seen it. I did not celebrate their separation. I want to be clear about that. There is no version of this story where a grandfather takes pleasure in watching his grandson's parents come apart. But I will tell you this. In the months since, I have quietly resumed some of what I used to provide, not to Marcus, but to Renee and the boys directly, in my own name this time, with no hidden accounts and no invisible hand pretending to be someone else's success. I moved back in with them in March, this time with my name properly, on a small addition Renee had built onto the back of the house, an actual guest suite with its own entrance, paid for openly, discussed openly, agreed to by everyone at that table with full understanding of who was contributing what. My grandsons still eat well. The mortgage still gets paid on time. But now, when anyone asks who's been holding this family together, there's no mystery to solve, no hidden ledger, no 6 years of silence protecting someone else's fragile pride. Last week, my youngest grandson asked me, completely unprompted, why Grandpa doesn't drive a nicer car if I have as much money as his mother says. I told him the truth. I told him that the car doesn't matter nearly as much as whether the people around you know the difference between what they've earned and what's been quietly given to them, and whether they have the decency to say thank you either way. He thought about that for a long moment, in the particular serious way 9-year-olds sometimes surprise you with, and then he asked if we could go fishing that weekend. We did. Just the two of us, out on the lake behind my old rental house, the one that used to hold my quiet accounting in an upstairs study and now just holds fishing gear and a spare bed for when the boys stay over. If there's one thing this whole ordeal taught me, it's that quiet generosity without any acknowledgement doesn't build gratitude. It builds a kind of blindness in the people receiving it, a blindness that eventually convinces them they did it all themselves. I loved my daughter's family enough to disappear into the background of their lives for 6 years, and in doing so, I nearly let one man believe he'd built an empire out of nothing but his own two hands, when really he'd been standing the whole time on ground I quietly leveled beneath him. I don't regret the years of quiet giving. I regret only that I let it go on so long without ever once being seen. Real family isn't built on what you're willing to hide for someone. It's built on what you're both willing to say out loud, at the same table, in front of everyone who matters. Blood gets you a seat at that table. It's honesty that earns you the right to stay in the room. If you made it this far, tell me where you're watching from tonight, son, daughter, mother, father, wherever you are sitting right now. And if you've ever quietly carried more weight in your family than anyone gave you credit for, hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments. There are more stories where this one came from.